Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm going to talk about exposure. I'll explain what it is and I'll show you how to use the different settings on your camera to really control your image and get the proper exposure for your photos. So let's get started. Okay, let's talk about exposure. So the simple definition of exposure is the amount of light that's hitting the film, or if you're using a digital camera, the sensor. But I thought I was going to do this little lesson on exposure, and I kind of realized that controlling exposure is pretty much the basics of photography and learning how to work with your camera. And you'll understand more of that later, but let's just start with kind of the basic overview. This is correct exposure. Underexposed is when the photo's a lot darker, and overexposed is when the photo's a lot brighter. And the exposure is kind of a sliding scale of brightness. It's not those three extremes. And this kind of shows you some of the variety that you can get through exposure. There's three main things that go into setting your exposure on your camera. So you have your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And this is often called the exposure triangle. So these three things together will affect the exposure and brightness of your photo, but each of them separately control different aspects of the image. So learning what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed each do is really important for controlling your shot and getting the shot that you're looking for. ISO actually stands for International Standards Organization, which I didn't know till recently, but it's basically the sensitivity of the film to light. Film has a number on it. For example, this one says 200, and that number is the ISO, and it will tell you how sensitive that film is to light. So the lower ISO numbers, like 100 or 200, the film is not as sensitive to light. So that's good for really bright outdoor settings where you have a lot of natural light and you don't need the film to be as sensitive. A higher ISO, like 8,000 or 12,000, that film is a lot more sensitive to light, so it's good for nighttime, indoor shots. And these images might look kind of similar, but with the higher ISO, you get a lot more noise in your photos. So if you look at the detail shots, the lower ISO is a lot smoother and crisper of a photo, and then the high ISO is a lot noisier and grainier. You can really see the difference in the close-up. And sometimes you need to shoot with a higher ISO because you are in a low light setting. Just be aware of the noise that it will add to your photo. So if you're not using film, most digital cameras have an automatic ISO setting where it'll just pick the best ISO based on the light situation and where you are. But if you want to have a little more control over your ISO, there are a lot of advanced cameras that have manual ISO settings too. Next is aperture. And aperture is how wide the lens is opening and how much light it's letting in during the shot. So aperture is measured by something called f-stops. And so to me, f-stops and aperture, it's kind of interchangeable. It's a similar concept, but a large aperture has an f-stop of 1.4 or something like 2. It will be a lower number. And a small aperture has an f-stop of a higher number, like f-stop 22 is usually the max that a lot of cameras will go to. And I know it gets a little confusing because this lower number is actually a larger aperture that's letting more light in, and the higher number is a smaller aperture that's letting less light in. So besides the amount of light that the aperture is letting in, it really affects the depth of field of your photo. So if you want your background to be really soft, out of focus, and blurry with just the object in focus, then you'll want a lower number, so a higher aperture. So this was shot with a 1.8. So something in the middle, like a 4.5, you'll see the background start to get more in focus, but it's still slightly blurred. And then a higher number, so a smaller aperture, will give you a deeper depth of field, so you'll get more in focus. This is good for landscapes where you want like the background to be really crisp and the object to be in focus as well. And here's a little bit of a close-up. You can see the shallow depth of field. The background is a lot more blurred. And then with the f-stop of 13, you can see a lot more of the background. And this was at a higher ISO, so you can see that noise too, like we talked about in the ISO section. When I first started photography, I really wanted to get this shallow depth of field, and I couldn't figure out, my camera would not go below a f-stop of 4, and I couldn't figure out how to get a larger aperture. Well, I figured out later on that your lens is actually a big part of how wide your aperture can get. So if you look on this Canon, it says 1.8. That can go to a 1.8 aperture. And then this Minolta says 2.8. That can only go to a 2.8 aperture. So if you were looking for something with an even shallower depth of field, a larger aperture, you won't be able to get that on this camera versus the Canon. So just something to keep in mind when you're choosing a lens. If you are trying to go for that shallow depth of field, you want to pick a lens that can have a larger aperture. So next, let's talk about shutter speed. This is pretty basic. It's what it sounds like, the length of time that the lens is open when it's taking the shot. So on the left here, this is a shutter speed of 1/6 of a second. That's pretty long. You can see there's a lot of motion. This bus is really blurry because the object was moving. Then 1/100th of a second is kind of in between. You can see a little bit of blur on the wheels and the car moving, but it's not as blurry as our 1/6 of a second shot. And then the last shot is 1/2000th of a second, which is pretty quick. And you'll see the car looks pretty much stopped, even though it was moving during the shot. So if you want to get motion in your shot, you might want to try playing around with a slower shutter speed. And if you're taking an action shot where you want the picture to be super crisp, you probably want to use a faster shutter speed. And then I also wanted to show you when the object is not moving, how shutter speed can affect it. So these images look pretty similar. This was taken at 1/20th of a second. This is 1/250th of a second. But when you zoom in, you'll see that the 1/20th of a second has kind of like a little bit of a blur, and that's camera shake. So when you shoot at a slower speed and you're just holding your camera and you don't have a tripod, the actual movement of your body and your hands can, show up in the photo. Where if you're shooting at a faster speed, it's usually so fast that it doesn't get that camera shake. So that's something to keep in mind if you don't have a tripod. I like to shoot at 1/125th of a second or faster to avoid the camera shake. I've also heard 1/60th of a second is kind of the baseline, but I find that sometimes 1/60th of a second even picks up my camera shake, so I like to shoot a little faster. How does this all come together, these three things? So every camera has a light meter, even like old cameras, and your light meter will show you what the correct exposure on based on what you're pointing your camera at. So if you're pointing it in direct sunlight, it's gonna read that differently than if you're indoors in a dark room. And when your light meter is at 0, that's considered the correct exposure. If it goes to the right, to these plus numbers, it's getting overexposed. If it goes to the left, it's getting underexposed. So the three things we learned about, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, all play together to get you what's showing up on your light meter. Typically in older cameras, the ISO you would set, and for at least that roll of film, it was the same ISO. So it was really shutter speed and aperture that play together to get the correct exposure. If you get a larger aperture that lets more light in, you have to have a faster shutter speed to balance that out. If you make your shutter speed slower and that lets more light in, you have to make your aperture smaller to let less light in. And that's a simplified way of showing how that balances out. So you'll see the light meter's correctly exposed right now, but if I change the shutter speed to faster, it gets underexposed. If I make the shutter speed slower, it's overexposed. And then same with the aperture. If I make it smaller, it's underexposed. If I make the aperture larger, it gets overexposed. And then this is in manual, and you'll see the ISO can play into it too. I'm choosing the ISO manually. If I do 100, I'm going to need a larger aperture to get the correct exposure. That was in manual. So shooting in manual, you control all the aspects of the shot, which is awesome. If you're learning photography, I highly recommend shooting some stuff in manual because you really get to learn how each aspect affects the photo. But there's a few other modes that you can shoot on too. Usually you can find it at the top of the camera and turn that meter to set different modes. So in manual, you have control over everything. And then automatic, the camera chooses everything. So the camera chooses the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And then there's two more that I really like shooting in these two. So one is aperture priority, where you have control of the aperture that you want. So if you are looking for a shallow depth of field or deep depth of field, you can set the correct aperture, and the camera will choose the best shutter speed based on the aperture that you want. And then shutter priority is similar, but you can choose the shutter speed and then the camera will choose the best aperture. And I like these because they're kind of a combination of manual and automatic. The camera helps you out a little bit, but you have more control over the shot and getting the type of image that you want. And also, shooting in manual every single time is not always realistic because a lot of times you're out and about and you need to get a quick shot. You don't have time to set up the camera perfectly every single time. So those are two other options that you can shoot in if you want a little more control of the camera settings and the exposure. Then you can correct your exposure in editing if you need to. It's a lot better to get the correct exposure while you're taking the shot, but you can always use Photoshop or another editing app after if you need to. So I'm going to pull up Photoshop here. I have my raw photo. This is the photo straight from the camera, but I think I want to make it a little brighter. You can correct this exposure this way. And you might want to correct a few other things as well. There's the before, there's the after. You can always make edits, but like I said, it's much better to get the exposure right as you're shooting and really understand your camera settings rather than always having to correct after the fact. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful and taught you everything you want to know about exposure. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe if you want more photo tutorials, tips, tricks. I'll be releasing more videos soon. I'll see you next time.